Greetings all! Okay, my summer holidays are over. Actually, my daughter was visiting from California for a couple of weeks and I spent my evenings and weekends with her and her dinosaurs instead of on my YouTubings. Not apologizing, just explaining. However, she has returned back home so I can get back to you guys now. Oh, admin note first. Hello Hannah. Yes, wife is in the next room. So, on with the questions. In, unlucky for some, Q&A number 13. As ever, the priority for questions goes to the patrons, with a few taken from other sources that I found very interesting. I suspect these scenes are also getting longer and longer, but we'll find out at the end of this. Starting off with Paul Tharp. In quite a few realistic/historic games and sound packs for games, the Russian D95T 122mm always makes a bing sound upon firing. Is this accurate? And if so, why? Now, it may come as something of a surprise to folks, but it's actually not overly loud inside a tank when it shoots. Now, believe me, it's dangerously loud if you stick your head out and is a life-changing experience. But when you're inside, the mechanisms of the gun are actually somewhat louder than the explosion. If you think about it, there are several inches of extremely strong metal between your ears and the boom. Then the gun, 1 or 2 tons of metal moving at high speed, slams backwards into the recoil stroke, and this massive breech block on the 122mm then slams open, and the gun strokes forward, again slamming into the stops when it returns into battery. Also, as this happens, the empty shell casing is also falling to the spent casing bin, or the whole floor, or whatever system is used for the things in whatever tank you're in. Why the 122 in particular makes a sound, and I have to say I've not heard it and I can't say, but I'll wager it's probably just a breech block and casing. Satan. What are the 3 most used methods to destroy/disable a tank? Well, this should not be too surprising. Saber rounds, missiles, and mines. The first are obvious enough. If you put a big enough amount of explosives under a tank, it'll pop the turret off. It doesn't need to be sophisticated in either form, such as explosively formed projectiles, or in trigger mechanisms. Just got to be big and go boom. And as I say, the saber rounds and missiles are standard things designed for purpose. Admiral Tiberius. In the ever-evolving war between weapons and defensive systems, as things sound right now, what side has the advantage, or is it effectively equal? I think it's still leaning towards weapons. So far, there is little to indicate that the latest generation of penetrators cannot do what they are supposed to, and nothing is ever going to be invulnerable anyway, especially from the side. I mean, even King Tigers got killed in World War II after all. There are the artillery and air-delivered sub-munitions I mentioned in a previous Q&A, which scared the hell out of me. On the other hand, active defenses are an excellent chance of reducing the danger of missiles, and even laser warning receivers can at least increase survivability. Tanks in the future are still going to die, just folks may have to work at it a bit more to make it happen. Hugo U. Why do most modern tanks still not have reverse cameras? Mainly because most modern tanks are basically 40 years old and reverse cameras weren't a thing at the time they were built. So unless somebody has specifically put it into an upgrade program, such as the Swedish did on the Leopard 2s, they don't have them. That said, the US at least has been futzing around with the DVRC for a while, the driver's rear view camera. It seems almost impossible to find a good picture of one outside of the initial announcement of 2007. However, it supposedly goes into the standard US Army taillight housing, and for good measure is also a thermal imager. It was listed as part of the Tusk upgrade, but this A2C appears to have one installed on the right hand side. Note the protective cage around the taillight and also what appears to be a little controllable flap covering the lens itself. Anyone who has operated M1s knows how quickly the taillights get coated with dust, so it would make sense that there would be an electronic flap which opens only when the driver engages reverse gear. Note also that it's next to the infantry telephone, which should reduce the chances of the driver reversing over someone about to talk to the tank before he has the opportunity to actually grab the intercom handset. I believe you'll find that any AFV designed in recent years will have a rear-view camera installed, especially as multifunction display panels become more common and it's easy to put the display up. Don't forget how old modern AFEs actually are in terms of their design, and review cameras on cars are really only a standard thing in the last decade or two. Chase Vols. My top 5 strangest tank designs. And I'm going to keep this to things which are actually built, because people can have very fertile imaginations, and I've seen some interesting ones. World War I is almost a gimme, as nobody really knew what a tank was supposed to look like in the first place. Enter the Tsar tank. The skeleton tank is a good second bet. I mean, it's logical, it makes sense, but obviously the design didn't really go anywhere. Unfortunately, after World War I, people started to understand what worked, so the really odd designs generally went away. If you ever have the opportunity to go visit Kubenka, many of the World War II museum vehicles have relocated to Patriot Park, but the variety of experimental designs that the Soviets tried is absolutely astonishing. Okay, yeah, sure, Object 279 is famous for being a bit weird, but actually it just makes inherent sense. Same with some of the other vehicles, such as Object 287 or the IT-1, which at first blush are just odd, but really do fit the design criteria. And it is something of a shame that I shall likely never get inside them. I'm not good enough friends with anybody in Kubenka. Even things we think are odd today, like putting the driver in a turret, was considered sensible enough to be tried out in multiple vehicles, both by the US and the Soviets. See MBT-7, the Object 416, or Object 775 for examples. STRV-103 counts, the S-Tank. It's a strange-looking tank, as defined by nothing has ever really been built before or since, barring the occasional testbed that looks anything like it. Absolutely, it was fit to task, but strange, nevertheless. The German VT-1 did kinda take it to the next level, mind, and I do hope to get inside that one day, though. These days, we think T-14 is a bit strange. Not as if the idea is new. Certainly the US tried it out in the 1980s with the TDB, and the logic is certainly there. It just took the commitment to try it out and put it into production. Andrew, no last name. David Fletcher did his 5 bottom tanks, both a British and foreign series. What would be my picks? As it happens, the Tank Museum did ask me to record such a thing. Of course, COVID happened and I didn't go over there, so I didn't record anything. I told them I couldn't do it, basically because it's pretty hard to beat David's list. Instead, I gave them a counter-proposal on a related premise, which I do hope to film next time that I am there, so watch this space. Joshua Conti. In terms of gameplay, historical accuracy, tactics, or other differences, which game do I like more? World of Tanks, World of Warships, World of Warplanes, or War Thunder? As people are wondering how I'm going to answer this one. Okay, contrary to popular conception, although I am an employee of Wargaming, which does the World of trilogy, I am allowed to play competitor games. And this is a question which is often asked. So I'll answer it yet again. Of those listed, mainly World of Tanks. When I feel like switching my brain off and just watching beautiful graphics and explosions, warships. The question did not mention Armored Warfare, which is the sort of the third game of the genre, and I played AW a lot longer than I did War Thunder. The latter simply didn't do anything for me at all. So here's the thing. People advocating for War Thunder say it's more realistic. It is, but it's not realistic. It's still an arcade game, and if I want to play an arcade game, I'll play World of Tanks. I just prefer it. If I want realistic, I'll play a proper simulator like Steel Beasts. Or did I just miss the infantry in War Thunder, which is kind of like an important part of war? And it's not just tanks, mind. I mean, I play DCS for an air sim. I have train sim. I'll probably buy flight sim when it comes out, although I don't know much about the pricing on that one. I prefer dangerous waters over cold waters. I like sims. I find War Thunder is neither fish nor fowl. It's not a pure arcade game, and it's certainly not a pure simulator. So overall, I guess the whole argument is Ford versus Holden. Horses for courses. I'm not interested in the shouting match in the comments below, by the way, either, over which of the two competitors is better. It is a statement of my own personal preference, not equality. So, some people consider games like Steel Beasts to be too hardcore and not enough fun. Well, there's probably a reason that Steel Beasts has so few players, regardless of how good it is. Okay, cost probably also has something to do with it as well, but Then again, the deluxe pack for Microsoft Flight Sim is coming in at about $120. Maybe you gotta get the $120 version for the Cessna 172? The steam gauge version, I think. Oh well. Commissar Karl, did GIs in World War II prefer to work with TDs or SP artillery over tanks due to either ease of communication or familiarity? How did tanks and infantry communicate before tank telephones and infantry radios? And has tank infantry communication gotten better since the end of World War II, or are radios and tank telephones about the best we can do? Now, allow me to pull out this book by Harry Yeide, The Infantry's Armour. And I shall read the appropriate paragraph that he has here. It's in a section for Normandy. Let's see. In the first hours after troops moved inland, operational planning was scant. Commanders on the scene made up the plans as they went. As had been the case on the beach, communications between the infantry and the tank initially were of the mouth-to-ear variety. This method had one major drawback that had already become apparent to tankers on other fronts. It was insanely dangerous under fire. The risk meant that often communication simply did not occur when things got hot. Oral communication was also rather haphazard, in part because tank crews could not see well through their periscopes, and the infantry had to get the crew's attention amidst the roar of battle in the tank's engine. Riflemen guiding tanks sometimes had to get in front and jump up and down to get the crew's attention. Tankers eventually figured out that the does often did not understand how blind they were when buttoned up, and tried to teach them. As a side note, Harry has made it a policy in his books that he refers to the infantrymen as doughs. So it comes from doughboy. That was the official term for what we now would call crunchies, used by the US Army back in World War II. So where today we would say gunner coax troops in a fire command, in World War II you would instruct the gunner to engage doughs. D-O-U-G-H. Okay. Now, part of the problem is that it used to be the case that tank and infantry radios did not talk to each other. For whatever reason, I don't know, I'm not in signals. And this was actually the case across most armies. One solution that was found was to send a tank from each company to an infantry battalion's headquarters. The folks in the radio tent for the infantry battalion would then yell instructions or requests received from the infantrymen up front over to the guys who were sitting on the tank, who would then relay forward on a tank radio net to the tanks that were up front next to the infantry. Obviously, this is a little bit inconvenient. And remember, we're talking about the US Army in Normandy, which is the most radio-equipped military in the world at the time. Watch my tracer is an extremely valid tactic, and frankly one I've used myself. In one idea, I had basically no idea what I was shooting at, but the infantry with me were very definitely shooting at it, so I figured it was worth a couple of 120mm rounds. It is worth noting that the discussion inside the tank just before then was along the lines of, what was that bang? Oh, I think it was the fuel tank blowing on that burning truck that we just went past. Hang on a second, driver stop. Everyone's out of the Humvee behind us and they're shooting in all four directions. I think something's up. Driver spin left, 90, gunner traverse left. This warrants investigation. Basically, we had no idea what was going on. We actually happened to look in the right direction. There are actually a couple of pages on the topic of infantry coordination in his book. And remember, the topic of the book is the independent tank battalions, which were intended to be assigned to infantry divisions. And some units were permanently attached to the divisions, sometimes they were just rotated around. The ones that were permanently attached, well, they had better communication. The eventual solution was to install the field telephones and wire them to the tank intercom system, and then later to give them walkie-talkies, the SCR-300, which is a backpack, I should add. It's not to be confused with the handy talkie, the SCR-516, which we think of today when we say walkie-talkie. Today, of course, all the radios do actually talk to each other, so when part of a mixed platoon of tanks and Humvee infantry, I could still talk to the dismounts directly when they weren't too busy to talk. There are still issues of battlefield tracking though, so equipping vehicles with Blue Force tracker is easy enough. There isn't one modeled here, but there's a little antenna that will go there. I had one on my tank. And so, the idea behind this is that they will easily show up on the map display. There's a little icon for your vehicle. But getting the system to show up for infantrymen reliably is a little bit less simple. Not least, it's a bit annoying for the infantryman in the squad who's wearing the thing. And this goes, there were experiments back maybe 20 years ago, 21st century soldier or something like that it was called, I can't recall off the top of my head. It was like it's a big iPad on your wrist. I don't know if they sorted this out yet. Caleb Engelhardt, why did armoured cars take an overall backseat in US service? What exactly made T-27 unsuitable for US service? Okay, T-27 and the competitor T-28 were developed to replace the M8 Greyhound, which was something of an expedient vehicle based off of a truck chassis. It was not a purpose-designed off-road armoured fighting vehicle chassis. Both T-27 and T-28 proved to be better vehicles than the M8, and T-28 was better than T-27, so T-27 died, which is the short answer to the question. Now, if you want to go on a little bit further into the details, if you look at the situation for reconnaissance, the T-28, later to be named the M38 or Wolfhound by the British, is a 6x6 with a 37mm gun in late 1944. Now, granted, there was a gun motor carriage, T-66, I think it was, with a 75, but we're talking about the M38 here. Also being produced for the cavalry units at about this time is the M24 General Chaffee light tank with a 75mm gun and tracks. The latter can go basically anywhere that the M38 could go and more. It may not have been as fast on the road as an M38, but it likely was faster off-road. So what really was the tactical purpose to the US Army and all its resources of the M38, which could not be filled by M24? And this generally proved to be the case for the US throughout the Cold War. It is notable for being one of the few militaries to not bother with making a wheeled APC, the V100s being more of an internal security vehicle. Through the Cold War, wheeled vehicles were cheaper, easier to maintain, perhaps better for conflicts less intense in World War III, easier to build bridges for, could normally float, and all the other various reasons why countries tended to buy them. But they were not the tactical equal to tracks. The US didn't care. It was the industrial and economic powerhouse. It could just throw additional resources at problems, put more engineers into the field to build more bridges for Bradleys, accept the slower speed of the M113 across the massively open plains of Germany or Korea in order to engage the increased ability to go anywhere. That was satire, by the way. There just did not seem to be any need for the tactical niche of wheeled AFVs in the US military until after the deployment of leg infantry to defend Saudi Arabia in 91, or 1990 more accurately, where they realized that they were basically just speed bumps, and so you have the idea to create striker units to give them air deployable troops a little bit more mobility and survivability. Yes, M113s can be transported by air, or even self-transportable if you look at the Aero Gavin. But spare track, the extra fuel and so on, all those things that you need to keep a tracked vehicle in the field and running also has to be transported by air as well. So it just simply makes less sense. Trivia bot. If the TC gets injured or knocked out, what happens? In an American tank, the gunner takes over. He may pull the TC down and move into the TC's position, or maybe just sit there where he is, may be situationally dependent. If he does move to the TC slot, he sets the gunner's control switches as he wants them, and then he uses the TC's control handle to aim and shoot. Although in my case, I could actually reach the gunner switches from the TC's position anyway, so it wasn't an issue. In a British tank, as I understand it, the loader is the next senior man in the crew, so he would take over. Plus, he's already sticking his head out the hatch anyway, so nobody needs to move anywhere. S-Face wants to know if the Japanese lunge mine was ever successfully used. Now, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically a shaped charge on the end of a stick. I am unaware of any US tanks killed by the mine, and neither have I encountered any test reports on defenses against it. So, sorry, I can't be more helpful. John Chase. If a tank is using a ranging machine gun, does it not run the risk of giving a heads up to the folks on the receiving end that a bigger bullet may be on the way? I don't think so. The first problem is telling the difference between a ranging machine gun hitting you and any other kind of machine gun which might hit your tank. The second problem is that the ranging gun doesn't necessarily have to hit you to be effective. As long as the strike can be observed, the main gun can simply be aimed off. And finally, the difference in time between the strike and then the gunner pushing the big button is such that I don't think it's likely that the target will be able to react quickly enough to make a difference anyway. Spackman N, Benedict Wagner, The Real Striker of Life, and others have all asked something along the lines of this following question. I am the Commander-in-Chief of the Armoured Corps of the newly formed neutral country of Elbonia in 1946. I am given the task of equipping the force with a tank destroyer, a medium tank, a light tank, an SPG, an APC, and an AA vehicle. But I am a traitor and loyal to another country, so I choose the worst possible options for individual models of vehicles. Also, I am only allowed to buy production vehicles, not put any concepts into production. On the upside, you can choose from all the various factions and countries of World War II, including the Axis, with a lot of the vehicles left sitting around. And with Elbonia being a rich country, cost is no problem. An interesting question, and I must wonder, what is it about Elbonia which so drives disloyalty? I am aware that my colleague over an infantry branch shares my leanings, presumably towards Nebonia. Are there others? Further, I thought the main national product of Elbonia was mud, so I'm actually not quite sure how we're going to afford this. But anyway, maybe breaking the bank is part of the plan. Certainly it is for my infantry counterpart. However, my small arms colleague has some advantages. Firstly, rifles are not exactly big ticket items which attract casual attention. He can get away with some things which are a bit obscure, which I cannot. And I would assume that if I said get lots of King Tigers, someone somewhere is going to go, they broke down a lot. Further, it seemed that almost every country has its own domestic small arms industry at the time, whilst tank manufacturing tended to be a little bit more restrictive. Further, to a large extent, a rifle is a rifle, without any particular additional factors to consider. A tank, however, can have the correct design vary widely depending on the nature of the country in question. Is Elbonia a mountainous country in the Alps? Is it heavily wooded with water obstacles like up in Scandinavia? Maybe it's a breakaway part of the steppes with large open plains. Is it Transnistria with no strategic depth at all? All these factors will have an effect on what makes a good tank for the nation, and also, conversely, a bad tank for the nation. I am assuming an educated population which can use the machines well enough and maintain them. However, absent this data, some general thoughts. Now, the first one is that, if you'll recall, my infantry counterpart was able to mix and match this weapon with that caliber. With a tank, I think that's a bit too easy, so I'm not going to do that. And again, we can't be too obvious about this. If we pick a vehicle from the losing side, it has to be very clearly a good vehicle. But if we pick one from the winning side, it runs the risk of, actually being a good vehicle. So what we want are vehicles which to the uninitiated, or at least vaguely initiated, seem reasonable. So we'll start with the small stuff, SPAA guns, which is an immediate issue because I actually couldn't find any truly bad ones which entered widespread service, even if I wanted to mix and match. So for example, let's say I stuck the 21K 45mm AA gun onto a wheeled mount. This AA gun was a converted anti-tank gun which did not have a timed fuse. It required a direct hit on the aircraft. Unfortunately, by the end of the war, the Soviets had discarded it. Thus, if I was to choose it, one would ask, why did you deliberately select something awful? Same with, say, the ZPU-4 model 1930, which is basically 4 Maxim machine guns in the back of a truck. Obviously outdated. Now, on the other hand, if you went the other way and you picked a vehicle with a big feck-off cannon and put it onto a tiny overloaded chassis, it could still be dangerous to any aircraft which happen to fly overhead. You start to see some of the problem. So there are two likely candidates that I might propose, the Centaur AA and the M8 with the M45. The Centaur AA has the problem of having two guns which are actually somewhat capable. But the vehicle it is based on has the Liberty engine, is unreliable, underpowered, and the suspension has not been upgraded to the same level as Cromwell was. It is in service with the British Army, so one of the major victorious powers, and it even has a whole bunch sold to Greece after the war, so it's obviously a good vehicle. The M8 with the M45 has its own set of problems. The caliber 50 seems to be the smallest caliber dedicated AA mount that I can find in service, and having 4 of them does make it quite dangerous against troops. However, the vehicle, though it has a great reputation in World War II, is still fundamentally a truck chassis of inferior mobility compared to most AFVs, and the caliber 50 is starting to be of limited range and effectiveness against modern aircraft. However, just because I want to make life difficult for the EMEs who have to maintain the thing, I'm going to have to go for the heavier tracked vehicle. The problem of truly bad things not having been accepted for production is going to be my ongoing bugbear for this challenge, by the way. The SPG is next on the list, and again there is something of a lack of vehicles to choose from. The choice here, I think, is going to be Canadian or Japanese. The Canadian entrant will be Sexton, and this seems very sellable to the uninitiated. It's on a great chassis and the 25-pounder gun has a great reputation. That said, however, it's only an 88mm gun, so it has much less bang at the other end. The Type 4 Hato was also very close to making requirements as a big heavy vehicle with a ridiculously low rate of fire and limited firing arc and angle, but only 4 of them were made, not 5 as the initial question said was a requirement. This leaves us with the Ho-Ro, a 15cm gun, which seems impressive enough, until one realizes it has an elevation limit of only 30 degrees, requiring the construction of ramps to have any sort of useful range or arc of fire. The diesel engine can be sold on the basis of great fuel efficiency, but of course would introduce an entirely new type of fuel to the supply line. Also, being a large gun on a fairly small chassis, very little ammunition can be carried, thus necessitating the procurement of an ammunition supply vehicle as well, so that also should suck up some more manpower, fuel, and whatever the currency is, IQUDs. An APC is going to be even more difficult to come up with, as there were basically none in service. I think it's going to be between Canada and Germany. There is a good argument for the 251 half-track. Now, this vehicle is operationally quite capable, and doubtless the incredible amount of variance combined with the reputation of it being part of the Blitzkrieg ought to help it be sold to the guys in procurement. On the other hand, the crews will curse having to lubricate every individual track link. The wheels are interleaved with the joys of changing an inside road wheel. The vehicle is basically a tank steering mechanism with an additional wheels mechanism on top of it, so the mechanics are going to hate it, and the front wheels aren't powered at all, which will limit mobility a bit. Hopefully the crew's mechanics will be too tired from staying up late fixing the thing to be combat effective. However, the design does have the potential to be improved. Witness the Type 1 Ho-Ha or the OT-810. And the flexibility means that the Elbonian government can save money by having all sorts of variants on a common chassis. We can't have that. The Canadian entry is a C-15TA. It's an armoured truck. It's not actually a bad vehicle per se. The main issues here are the relative lack of protection and firepower, and the fact that it's a 4x4, which ought to kill the mobility. Plus, it has very little room for expansion, so it can't be turned into any variants really other than maybe an ambulance. There are a few thousand hanging around in Europe after the victory, so they'll be an easy sell as well. After all, again, they were part of the winning team. On to the tank destroyers, and I don't see any competition here. It's Jägertiger. The thing is just so ridiculously huge and heavy. The Elbonian Chief of Engineers is going to be pulling his hair out trying to figure out tactical bridging requirements, which will be necessary because the vehicle will likely overload many fixed bridges in Elbonia, and the Transportation Corps will likely have to buy super heavy tank transporters just for it. The gun is stupidly overpowered for 1946 needs against basically anything shy of an IS-3. Had I picked a smaller caliber weapon with smaller munitions like HVAP or Sabo, those would probably do the job just fine, and they would have the advantage of carrying a reasonable amount of ammunition with a far better reload speed. Plus, the 128 is a fairly unique caliber to bring into service. God knows where they're going to get the ammunition. It's a case-mated vehicle, and thus not very tactically flexible, and it is ridiculously hard to hide. Then we add in on top of this the joys and maintenance requirements. But it looks impressive, and on parade, Elbonia will have the best tank destroyers in the world. On to the light tank. This one similarly seems to have little competition. By the end of the war, light tanks were either starting to become competent, such as the M24 T70M, or they had been generally gotten rid of. The L6 might be an honourable mention, but it obviously was based on a pre-war design, and picking it might be suspicious. Thus, I nominate Light Tank Mark 8, the Harry Hopkins. It's light. It's one of the lightest tanks being produced in 1945. It's from the winning side. It's in production as of only last year. It can fit into a glider, which actually may be a bad thing depending on how expeditionary Elbonia is. Of course, the cannon is useless with bugger all high explosive capability. The turret is a two-man affair with limited vision. The running gear and steering is just plain weird. It has no components in common with any other vehicle in service with Elbonia, and it cannot float. A heavy tank was not mentioned, but I'm going to consider it anyway as part of a good balanced force. Besides, heavy tanks are expensive and it should help break the bank. After all, other big powers are doing it with the IS and T-26 heavy tanks now in service. The first thought is Black Prince. It's descended from the line of very successful Churchill infantry tanks. It has a great pedigree. It comes with a well-regarded 17-pounder gun. It looks big, bulky, and mean. It's British. It's from the winning side. It is also, though it may not be entirely obvious in 1946, utterly obsolete, underpowered, and under-armoured for the job. Plus, it was a prototype. 6 vehicles were made, putting it over the threshold for acceptability by the rules. But again, people may start wondering why Elbonia is the only customer. So I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to say that we should get IS-3s. Obviously, this is a great tank. It stunned the world late last year when it was revealed. We Elbonians absolutely must have it. Okay, yeah, I know they cost 350,000 rubles apiece, whatever the ruble exchange rate is. But look at the slopes. Look at the size of the gun. Absolutely worth every iQuid. Should be an easy sell. Now, of course, I know something that most other Elbonians don't. It's a heavy tank, but that means even more trouble for the bridging units that have to support it. It's a diesel, further splitting our logistical requirements. This time up a line unit, though, as opposed to the artillery park where the last diesel was. The interior is a bit cramped. The gun has a slow rate of fire and only limited ammunition, about 22 rounds. Oh, and there are some hidden design flaws which will become obvious next year. The engine mounting is poor, the oil booster pump is ineffective, the gearbox needs modification, the turret overloads the hull roof, the road wheels and final drives have bad seals. Fixing all this is going to add some 2/3 to the unit price, an additional 250,000 rubles per vehicle, and it still won't fix various problems such as the structural rigidity or unreliability, which in Soviet service would not be fixed until the 1950s IS-3M upgrade program. So with any luck, this tank should also soak up a lot of the EME's man hours. The downside, it actually is quite a nasty tank. If Elbonia hasn't gone broke yet, and if they do get to the fight, they might actually prove a problem for the opposition. Well, great reward requires great risk. This now leaves us to the medium tank. My first thought is to go with the Stridsvagn M42, which is awfully cramped, has an interesting powertrain, a 75mm gun, is a generation out of date compared to other tanks of 1946, plus it's a little bit top heavy, and it comes from another neutral country, so it's politically wonderful. However, it doesn't require a tank expert to realize that there are now better tanks out there. Instead, I shall use my crystal ball and try to find an apparently modern tank which, though people don't realize it yet, is on the verge of being obsolete immediately. To me, that tank is Comet. Now, I am aware that the tank served in the British Army until 1958. I'm aware that it has an excellent Meteor engine, reasonably capable suspension and steering systems. The problem again is that it is impossible to find a production tank which is complete rubbish. Fortunately, Comet has flaws enough anyway. I mean, have you seen me try to get into the thing? Comet is very definitely a World War II tank design with a lineage that goes back basically to the very start of the war. It eschews any form of sloping armor. The interior space is ridiculously small, not least because of the huge suspension springs inside, which also require disassembling the side armor plates to work on. It has no fancy things like stabilizers, and it's combined with basically zero upgrade potential. The 77mm gun is one of the smallest modern guns with a suitably small HE round. It doesn't have the raw punch of the 17-pounder or indeed basically anything else that was coming on stream in 1945. The ergonomics overall are horrible, and hopefully the 7.92mm Beza machine gun will cause havoc with the supply system. With Comet as the frontline tank of the Elbonian army, the military is equipped with what will prove to be a highly regarded paperweight in about 2 or 3 years. So, now that Ian and myself have now thoroughly hosed Elbonia, somebody go nab Drac for the Navy and Bismarck for the Air Corps. Which now brings us to the gun of the month. And this time we're going back in time to actually the first gun that I ever purchased. It is a SIG Pro P2340 in 40 cal Smith & Wesson. And it is a polymer framed pistol. The reason I picked it was I had experience with SIGs before. I like them. I really do like SIGs. It feels better in my hand than Glocks. I like the idea of a polymer frame being a bit lighter. But I wasn't entirely in the firearm state of mind at the time. So remember, I had only recently transferred over from Ireland, where basically at the time guns were bad, icky things, and only the army and maybe the police, and even the police generally aren't armed, would have them. And so it was kind of like, my God, I own a gun. And it took a couple of years for me to convert from the European mentality to the American mentality. And it's one of those things. So don't try to apply European gun laws to America. Don't try to apply American gun laws to Europe. It doesn't make sense. They're different countries. That's beside any constitutional issues or anything else. It just doesn't make sense sociologically. They call it a compact. I think it's a full size. So they call it a compact. One of the nice things, several nice things I like about it is, for starters, there's no external safety. There is a decocker, so you simply pull down on this and you have your round chambered, no problem at all. Common thing with SIGs. Compared to the last semi-auto pistol I had out here, the 1911, disassembly is really, really bloody easy. So you just kind of pull it back, pop out the slide release. And that's basically it. You are done. You've now stripped the SIG Pro. It came with a detachable grip. Now, unfortunately, the grip that I wanted to use, a bigger grip, over the intervening 20 years, the rubber has deteriorated to such an extent that I can no longer use it. So I've had to replace it with the smaller stippled grip. Replacement parts for these things, by the way, are really bloody expensive. So that's why I'm still using the smaller one. It's fun to shoot. I like it. One nice thing about it is it's kind of flexible. So I put this away. I take out this one. Doesn't take a whole hell of a long time at the range or wherever. And this is one of those things where people that think ballistics, fingerprinting barrels and so on is so useful an idea. It doesn't take a whole hell of a lot of time to replace the barrel. Come on, yep, let's screw that one up. And I now have a SIG Pro P2340 in 357 SIG, which is quite impressive in an indoor range. I mean, it's quite a bang. It's got a fair bit of flip. But this is actually my standard home defense weapon with suitable ammunition. I mean, there's not much more to say about it. I mean, would I buy it again? No, there are definitely better pistols out there today, but it's back in the year 2000 when this thing was only 2 years old as a design. It's pretty much up there in terms of modern equipment. Christopher Cox, conventional artillery versus missiles or drones. So apparently someone on another channel, and sadly he provided no link to expand on this, has opined that tube artillery is obsolescent, and Christopher rather objects to this. And I'm inclined to rather agree with Christopher on this one. And that's before you get to the massive cost differential of rounds. So for starters, the response time of tube artillery is likely far more rapid. So for example, we'd have troops in contact in Afghanistan some 25 kilometers from the base. Rounds went downrange in maybe a minute after the call, and they had a 2.5 minute time of flight. Now when you're under fire and waiting for the opposition to be suppressed, 3.5 minutes is plenty long enough. And I would think that waiting for a missile to show up would be rather interminable, or the fight would be over. Your next issue is counter-battery. Now again, speed is of the essence, and I suspect that even a towed artillery unit could well be gone by the time a missile gets there. As for using a drone, like a Predator with Hellfires or whatever, I'm going to presume that this all requires a vaguely permissive air environment. Now today we're so used to being able to fly our drones over wherever we want, and I think we've started taking it for granted. And even in my majors course, we seem to be just assuming an exercise that would have drone reconnaissance wherever we wanted. Now, in fairness, MLRS is now a counter-battery asset with a slightly slower time of flight, but I think that can be kind of mitigated by the fact that it simply removes the entire grid square, so you'll probably still get the artillery battery even if it's on the move. And MLRS is still faster than a typical missile. There are plenty of fire missions that I think a missile system cannot conduct, such as suppression or interdiction fire. Sort of occasionally lob around every couple of minutes at an intersection. Keep a 2 or 3 minute barrage on a target while you close. Set up a smoke screen. A modern tube artillery, like the Panzer IV 2000, can do a 6-round time on target out of one tube. The casualties and psychological shock resulting from 2 sequential battery 6s within a minute probably cannot be replicated by a missile unit. Now I'm sure some redlegs watching this are going to be able to add more reasons why tube artillery is far from being on the way out, but please link me to the original discussion on this one and I'll be very curious to hear what the supporting logic was. As I say, I'm not on board. I may be open to be convinced, but it'll take some convincing. Alexander H. When did the Army start putting fire extinguishers on the outsides of vehicles? I saw them on Abrams and Bradleys. Unfortunately, it's on this side here. T-handle. And I had to pull out the books actually on this one. And it's not helped by the fact that the Army keeps moving the things. So as I say, on the M1, on the outside of the hull. On an M60, you'll find it on the front slope, and that's a position which goes back quite a few tanks. On the M4, you need to look under the bustle on the engine deck, which perhaps can be a little bit tough to get at from the ground. It appears also that at least some M3 mediums had it as well, but I cannot see any for the M2 medium, so that seems to indicate that 1940 or so is the answer to your question. David Seelan. If you think Irish is hard, by the way, you should try Welsh. Anyway, platoon size, 3, 4, or 5. 5 is most common for World War II, 4 for most of the Cold War with NATO, and 3 is not uncommon now. Now I seem to recall, it's going back a few years, various studies were done, 5 is the least efficient number with the greatest chance of targets being engaged by multiple tanks and is most difficult to control. 3 is the most efficient in terms of platoon firepower, but I think it's a little bit inflexible, and the loss of a single tank for whatever reason is a serious percentage hit on the platoon's firepower and observation capabilities, i.e. how many eyeballs have you got out looking to find things to shoot at. I think the move to 3 is because of budget consciousness. If you must have a battalion but you can't afford 50-something tanks. 4 tanks in a platoon makes sense to me. With the possibility of 2 equal-sized sections maneuvering in support of each other. Oscar Larson. What is the difference between a smoothbore and rifled cannon? This is one of those fundamental questions I probably need to address in Tanks 104, but for now, just accept that a smoothbore loses less power through the grooves past the projectile, no force is wasted in spinning versus going forwards, and is cheaper and easier to make. On the downside, you may have to leave a little bit of room in the shell for a tail fin for stabilization, as opposed to just having a big payload in the shell for HE, WP, or whatever. So that's your 5-cent explanation. Robert Henry Ilston. The Challenger, who by the way is my European counterpart working for all the tanks. If you're not familiar with him, he's a former Royal Tank Regiment RSM. He posted a picture of a tank crew using the side skirts folded horizontally, I think it was a Centurion, as a dining table. And, of course, I also note often sleeping accommodations. What is the best, not in the manual, example I've seen of part of an armored vehicle not being used in a way that was intended? Well, miraculously, that's being used in a way not intended. Now, I'm a little bit limited in my experience, and I suspect that every crewman will pick up little quirks for the vehicle which are likely only passed by word of mouth to other crewmen. So, for example, if you have a block of wood about a foot high, you can put it under the back ramp of the Bradley, making it horizontal, giving you a great sleeping space. Our dining table on the M1, well, that's the front slope cafe. The primary purpose of the M1's turbine engine, even more so than moving the tank, is to provide warmth to people standing behind it. Now, normally these things are generally fairly harmless, but there was one thing done on the M1 which turned out was not good for the tank. And that was mounting a spare road wheel on the turret roof using the bolt holes which are forward of the loader's position, kind of forward of the CITV. Not only is it a good place to use the road wheel, it also works as a reasonable trash can. You just kind of chuck the bottle or whatever it was into the road wheel, and surprisingly, it actually generally stayed there. The problem, though, is that the bolt holes are designed for lifting eyes. So when the tank turrets gets pulled for maintenance, these bolts get undone, and lifting eyes, rather large ones, are screwed into the hole instead. The bolt really is just there to fill up the gap, and well, the eye, of course, is what you attach the cables to. Now, unfortunately, the thread of the lifting eye bolt and the thread of the bolts that were used by the road wheels are similar, but not the same. So crews that mounted the road wheel there, and my crew was as guilty of it as any other because nobody told us not to do it, would often damage the threading and prevent the lifting eyes from performing as advertised, or at least being easily installed. Now, eventually, and I recall an article in PS Monthly magazine about this, the Army did do the troops a solid. They started issuing out bolts which not only protected the thread for the lifting eyes, but also could be used to mount a road wheel. And I was having a chat with one tanker about it, and he never knew this was an issue in current service, so perhaps they are now standard issue bolts. So again, I've no doubt that crewmen of all sorts of vehicles can chime in with comments about odd tricks that they picked up in the comments down below, but since I didn't crew them, I can't tell you what they are. TN Sheep gives us a philosophical question. He asked Bovington in their Q&A, a similar one, but he figures I might have a different perspective. What are my feelings on using or making modern parts to restore some older engines in order to bring historical vehicles to life? Now, he's referring to the Q&A series that the curator of Bovington, David Riley, has been doing while at home in quarantine. And David gave a fairly thorough answer. And as TN Sheep observed in his more expanded question, they consider the historic significance of a vehicle to be very important. They would be, for example, more willing to futz with a rebuilt or re-engined tank than one which has had the same engine in it from the day it left the factory. The post-war built Panther made for the British Army, for example, might be less of an issue for them to work on than one that was captured in 1944, that sort of thing. I don't think I'm quite as hardcore on that as Bovington are. I am willing to see a 1944 built engine torn apart and repaired by a modern mechanic. If the bolt was screwed in place by Hans in the height of World War II, maybe when he was carrying, taking cover under an air raid, it's an interesting talking point, but I'm not sure it actually teaches anyone anything. And if you can't see inside the engine, and if you can't run it, then the value of being able to say, this engine hasn't been opened up since 1944 seems kind of weak. I mean, it's sort of like saying, we buried a time capsule in 1940, but we will never ever open it, because if we do, then we will no longer have a time capsule of 1940s stuff under there anymore. What do you get out of it? I'd rather that the bolt be undone, the engine inspected and repaired for whatever information might be yielded, and then the same bolt put right back in the same place to the same torque specifications. Now, that said, I will not advocate for a replacement of older materials with modern. So, for example, electrical wires back in the day were often insulated by braided cloth, not plastic as you'd see today. Functionally, there would be no particular difference between repairing a tank with plastic versus braided wiring, and generally speaking, nobody is going to see it. It may actually even be safer, but to me it would be wrong. If nothing else, the tank loses its reference value if you do that. Things get more interesting when it's not functionally equivalent. So let's say you could use modern metallurgical technique to make a stronger final drive for your Panther that you just happen to have in the garage. Especially if you keep the same straight spur gears so that visually they're identical, mechanically they're identical, just metallurgically they have a different composition. And I think I'll be willing to cut a little bit of slack there. The purpose of doing such a thing would be to have a tank in operational condition, and anything breaking cannot be good for the tank overall. And the historical benefit is in the tank moving for the audience. I would not, however, advocate for any mechanical changes to the design, even if it does make the tank's engine more reliable or easier to steer or whatever. So I can see Bovington's position. I'm not sure I agree with the extent that they have taken it, but I certainly cannot argue that it is wrong. Kazuki K is back to 2. Question 1. Was there ever any attempt to mount a radial engine on a tank to be flat? Basically, you rotate it 90 degrees forward with the drive shaft coming straight down instead of forwards. And that way you reduce the high silhouette problems such as on the M4. Now, I have to say I'm not aware of any. Now, I don't know if that's because of some automotive reason that radials at the time don't like to work horizontally. And I will asterisk that with a note that a company in Ohio has been working on modern radials capable of being mounted at all angles. Or is there a mechanical reason to not doing so? I'm going for the mechanics of the problem though. If you lay a radial engine flat, you've just increased the horizontal length of the hull. And I do not believe you could kind of rejigger the components of the tank above and below to make up for this. If you increase the length of the hull, you are also increasing the volume to be protected, which means the weight of the tank, and also you have steering problems and whatever else. Further, radials are air-cooled, so you need to have some airflow route for a flat-mounted engine, whatever way that engine airflow is going to work. So I'm not sure it's worth the extra 6 or 8 inches of height that you get, whatever the benefit turns out to be. Question on commo. How did messages get from the front line to artillery units in the rear? What stopped enemy folks from calling fire requests on the artillery frequency on friendly positions, for example? Okay, I'm happy to say that this problem predates me. I am used to encrypted frequency hopping radios, and the worst I could worry about maybe would be triangulation, which does beg a question, if there's any single folks out listening who can answer this. It used to be the case that you would set up transmitters a few hundred meters away from a command post so that if the transmitters were triangulated, the worst that happens is the loss of the antennas and you go switch to the spares. These days that doesn't seem to be taught, and the antenna tend to go up right next to the tent. Now I would presume that frequency hopping and encryption makes any transmissions eavesdrop proof, but I am also presuming that there's a whole bunch of wattage coming out of the antenna. And can you not triangulate upon that emitted energy? Or is that not feasible? I don't know. You tell me. Anyway, I've digressed. In the old days, things were annoying. The US Army has the SOI, the Signals Operating Instructions. And I don't know what other countries had or what they called it, but I presume they had something similar. It's basically a booklet, or at least a couple of pages stapled together, which indicates how the unit is going to talk today. And it would change every day. If you had a programmable encryption device on your radio, it would give you the settings for that. It gave you the frequencies that were being used that day. It would give you the call signs. If there were code words to be used, it gave you those. And finally, it would give you the authentication codes for the day. It's effectively a password to get accepted onto the net. The challenge would be given to authenticate, and someone would have to run down the SOI to get the correct response. If the person on the radio failed to authenticate, procedure would generally be to ignore the caller and maybe even move to an alternate frequency, which is also listed on the SOI. Of course, the reality would likely be, in response to a claim, failed to authenticate, I'm going to ignore you, there would be a stream of colourful invectives from the poor bugger under fire who can't find the code book right now, which had a chance of convincing the person on the receiving end to conduct a fire mission anyway, at least after checking on a map for any obvious issues. Lux de Lynx. In my opinion, how effective would the Panzer IV K with the sloped frontal armour have been? Well, evidently not effective enough for the Germans to run with it. Spielberger apparently claimed that the armour alone increased the weight of the vehicle by over 3/4 of a ton. In order to alleviate mobility problems on the already overloaded chassis, and remember this was originally a sub 20 ton vehicle which was now hitting some 27 tons, it would necessitate larger tracks, and it was considered to move to triple width road wheels instead of the standard double, one on each side of the centre guide. So now you're looking at two on one side and one on the other. These larger tracks themselves added weight to the vehicle, added to the steering troubles, and road wheel service life was considered suspect. As a result, the whole idea was abandoned. It is worth noting also that at the time it was being considered, in late 42, early 43, it was being called the APHE. I suspect the term K or L is a post-war invention to prevent confusion with the H as it actually was eventually produced. Builder 396. For two-man turrets, some had the commander be the loader and some the gunner. Which do I think was better? I vote for commander as loader for two reasons. Firstly, handoff of the target will be easier. You see the target? No. Okay, move right. Versus hop down, look in the sight, don't see it, hop out, reacquire the target, hop down, adjust the sight, fine-tune, take forever. The other reason is that not all targets require a loader. If it's a coaxial machine gun engagement, loading the main gun simply isn't a concern in the first place, so just have the gunner gun. Timothy Foley asked a similar question. Gunner to the right of the gun, such as in modern NATO tanks, or gunner to the left, such as on Russian vehicles? Well, in today's Russian vehicles, it doesn't matter so much as they're autoloaders, so they may as well have somebody sitting to the left of the gun. Traditionally, gunners were often to be found on the left-hand side. You'll see it on many World War II tanks, but today, of course, the loader is on the left. The loader on the left for modern tanks is easily enough explained by the size of the round. Back when rounds were much smaller, it didn't really matter which hand you used to load, but with today's large rounds, most folks being right-handed, it proved easier for them to load with the right arm for that extra push on the weight. Now that explains why the loader moved to the left, but what had the gunner on the left before that? And I suspect this is also because folks are right-handed. So before powered gun elevation systems, such as you find on the Sherman, the normal way to aim the gun in elevation is with a crank next to the gun. If the gunner is to the left of the gun, he uses his right arm for elevating. He traverses with the left. Now, if you really needed extra strength to traverse, it was not unheard of for a second-hand crank to be found where another crewman, such as the loader, would be able to access it. And if the gun had power traverse but manual elevation, let's say a T-34 for example, the control handle being on the left for traverse simply isn't an issue in the first place, so the gunner controlling the elevation with his right just simply makes sense. Joshua D. Quinty, and yes, I'm doing reasonably well, thank you for asking. Do I think that the M551 was a good or a terrible replacement for the simpler M41 Walker Bulldog? And if the US had upgraded M41 as other countries did, might it have been kept in service for longer? Second question first, probably not. Light tanks basically fell out of US Army favor, so there would be little point in an upgraded light tank if the US wasn't interested in light tanks of any sort in the first place. And even upgraded with, let's say, a 90mm, I'm not sure it would have been up to snuff against the Red Soviet horde in Germany. The M551 wasn't a light tank and as such didn't fill the same slot as M41. M551 was an armoured reconnaissance / airborne assault vehicle, designed with a different set of specifications in mind. Unlike M41, it was designed to be flown around the world and chucked out of aircraft. It was also designed to be amphibious. It can be argued, certainly, whether or not M551 was good at the AR/AAV role, and its service history with the US military seems to indicate some lack of success. Its use as a light tank in Vietnam, I think, was more something forced upon the US due to the lack of an actual light tank. M41 was gone, M56 had no armor, M114 just generally sucked, even with the 20mm cannon. It's worth noting that a bunch of the vehicles sent to Vietnam never had the missile systems fitted in the first place. That said, one may also wonder whether or not the M41 would have actually proven to be much better. M41 was a little bigger, the gun made a much smaller bang, and it did not have the beehive round which would staple platoons of enemy infantry to the local flora. Sure, Sheridan had weak armor, but it wasn't as if an M41 was going to be stopping RPGs either. RAW, what's my take on a T95 medium tank? Are there any in good condition anywhere? Apparently not. The one I've seen in Fort Benning was a test bed for the new lifting suspension system and had been heavily modified from the original configuration. I'm tracking at least 3 as monuments on open air display, and I can only imagine the condition of those ones. Besides, they generally just have the normal M48 turrets. The exception is the one in Armada, Michigan, however it got there, with most of the XM66 turret. It seems to have just sheet metal where the cupola might go. In the end, the series of tanks seems to have been more of a sort of technology demonstrator series than anything which was going to result in a practical new tank. The ones with the purpose-built turrets certainly did look nice though, and it also meant that the US was given at least some practical experience with new technologies like Optar or various new gun types. Robodusk. Why is towing something behind a tank a questionable activity? After all, the towing pintle is there for a reason. It doesn't actually cost all that much to add, and especially on administrative runs, it certainly can be reasonable to bring along some extra stuff to a new unit supply point. There are plenty of pictures of tanks doing it, and in some cases, right up to the firing line for vehicles which are conducting indirect fire missions and might want to bring a little extra ammo along. Now, of course, the main use for the pintle is for a tow bar for towing things, but you can fit a quarter-ton trailer behind a tank if you fit the exhaust deflector. The main problem is that if you're towing a trailer, with one exception, you can no longer reasonably neutral steer or reverse. And we're not talking like an articulated 18-wheeler truck here where the driver can constantly keep an eye on the trailer in the mirror. There is also the question of whether the trailer and its cargo can survive being thrown about if the tank uses its tracked off-road ability and goes off on the bumpy bits. See the discussion by David Fletcher on the Rota trailer at the end of Crusader Part 1 video, and also my written articles linked below. And of course, if you get ambushed on the way, or if it turns out you don't actually have time to detour to the supply point to drop off your trailer, you now have an added complication. The one notable exception to these issues is the post-war mono trailer as found behind Centurion, and it was also tested by the US as well. And that was a semi-rigid affair. It did not bend or hinge relative to the tank as the tank turned. The only articulation was vertical, so as the tank went over bumps, it would go up or down. That one wheel at the back would keep it up, basically, and it was a caster wheel. It still added about 50% to the overall length of the tank though, so you have to be very, very careful in tight spaces such as a German village, which, oh, by the way, was the sort of place this thing was going to fight. You can imagine why we never saw a successor. How come more tanks didn't have automatic transmissions? Actually, I'm not sure they were invented early enough. The Hydromatic, as found in M5 Stewart's, was put on sale in 1939 for automobiles, and a tank likely puts a little bit more strain on things. Plus, the system needs to be thoroughly tested before the government is going to approve it to go into a really expensive thing like a tank. Remember, even synchronized gears for manual transmissions weren't necessarily a standard thing in the early war. You would have to double declutch quite a few vehicles. The closest that you will come to it in the pre-war era is the pre-selector, such as found on Matilda II or Panzer XXXVIII-T. It still required pushing a pedal to change gears on demand, but it was much easier to drive than a manual transmission. Why it was not used on mid-war production vehicles, with a few exceptions, I can't tell you. Adam Schindler. Have I considered a video on 73 Easting /Norfolk /Medina Ridge? Not really. There are already videos out there which include interviews with the veterans, and the engagement is quite well covered. I'm not convinced that I can add anything of value. My videos on the Battle of France or River Plate are kind of exceptions to my general rule of not covering battles anyway, because I tried to focus more on things which weren't so well known. Gordonia. No, I have no idea what happens to the M1's turbine power output when it runs on an alternate fuel to standard. We never ran out of JP8, so we never had to find out. What did change, though, was the smoke generator, the vehicle smoke system. When the standard's fuel system went from diesel to JP8, the smoke generator no longer worked, so it was basically disconnected. Charles Sherman, top 5 worst tank crew positions. Difficult enough. Certainly there are some which I personally took strong exception to, such as Comet's driver's position or Sentinel's gunner's position, but I accept that that may also be because I am a well-fed modern lad, so if I try to keep it to the problems just for the crewmen of the time, i.e. problems that even shortfeckers would have had an issue with, bow gunner on T-34, as you mentioned, certainly goes up there. It must be miserable being mostly blind and stuck if the tank catches fire. You're basically just waiting for the round to come through the wall. Loader on the M4. Plenty comfortable and fightable, but also mostly blind and stuck if the tank catches fire. I should say this is the earlier M4 without the loader's hatch. Gunner's position on the SCRV M42. And I can't imagine the typical Viking-blooded folks of Scandinavia, even of World War II era, fitting very well in it. The gunner's position on Firefly, and this is actually a bit of a reverse. It's actually not too god-awful for me because I have a good wingspan. I can more easily reach all the various controls and sights than a shorter person of World War II vintage. Top of the list. Commander's position of an R35 or H35. You're stupidly overworked, blind, uncomfortable, isolated, incommunicado, and you have a pointless gun. Joshua D. Conti again, which is fair because I basically skipped a month of Q&A questions. Why have rounds such as APHE, APHE, APCBC, etc. fallen out of tank use? Why now rely solely on APDS and heat? APHE and APCBC rounds were basically made obsolete by Sabre rounds. Their sole function is to use kinetic energy to punch through armor, and things like the cap will just help it bite a little bit more. Sabo does it all much better. APHE sacrificed armor punch for post-penetration effect. Opinions are split in this. You'll notice that the British in World War II tended to dislike this so much that they occasionally replaced the high explosive with more metal. As armor became thicker and thicker, two things happened. First, you can no longer afford to sacrifice that bit of punch for the explosion on the inside because you might not get into the inside to explode inside in the first place. Secondly, as the armor got thicker, this meant that as the Sabo penetrator went through, there was a lot more metal being displaced, creating much more spalling, the little bits of hot metal which start to fly around inside the tank and make everybody unhappy. So there was less need for a post-penetration explosion to begin with. A kill would happen either way. Heat has the advantage of not really caring what range or speed the round is fired at in order to have the same effect, and it also works nicely at killing things which do not have enough armor to create good spalling effects. Hugo U. Was there a reason that the US and UK used both inches and millimeters? I have not seen anything specific. When it comes to weapons calibers, it seems that the US tended to use whatever the thing originally was. Thus, if it was produced domestically, it would be in imperial measurements, and if it was procured abroad, it would be foreign. So the 75mm on a Sherman was originally the French 75. The 37mm was basically derived somewhat from the German 37mm, the Pak 36. The 40mm before as well, that was from Sweden. Same with the 20mm Oerlikon, well, that also came from Europe, all millimeters. The interesting exception seems to be the 6-pounder. But that probably would have just confused the hell out of Americans, so I can understand that change. Near as I can tell, the British did the same thing. If it were domestically produced, it went by weight of shot. If it came from the US, like the M10 self-propelled mount 3-inch, they used the American nomenclature. And if it was ultimately sourced from Europe, like the 75, well, there you go. The American 76 is the obvious exception to the rule here, as it was entirely domestically produced. However, they had to rename the caliber to avoid confusion with the 3-inch gun. Same with the British 77mm. It was a 76mm gun, but the name was already taken by the Americans. The 17 pounder was the same shell, but a different cartridge size, so that name wouldn't work. And 3-inch was also already in service with the British, the M10 again. So 77mm it had to be. As you can imagine, bad things happen if multiple calibers have the same name. A famous instance was the 90mm ammunition for the T26E4, which ended up being misdirected to a unit which was trialling a new towed 90mm anti-tank gun, but that was the older, shorter M3 type gun. The error was noted when the tank destroyer unit called up inquiring why the ammunition didn't seem to fit. That said, I don't know enough about the development history of the 90mm gun to know what that one was about, why that one was metric. There were some other changes. So for example, I had commented on the Archer video that the manual for some reason gave armor thicknesses in millimeters. I don't know why. He had another question as well. We know that T-34 and KV-1 came as something of a surprise to the Germans. Was it the same for Sherman and Churchill? That's actually a good question, and I don't know the answer. I suspect the answer is yes, but that is pure suspicion. If anyone else has the answer for this, please put it in the comments below. Advance to Contact 01. Was there ever any thought by the US Army of putting a gun shield onto the 50 cals on the Sherman? Actually, sort of. There was a clamshell designed for the M18's 50 cal which could open up for anti-air work, but the preferred solution for the TC's heavy machine gun on the Sherman was to simply enclose it entirely in a cupola, a bit like the caliber 30 cupola on the M3 Medium, but bigger. Andrew M. No, I have not seen any AARs or assessments of Turkish tank crews in Syria. I also have never heard of a modern tank gun barrel failing from overheating. I presume that this is the image to which you refer. I think it more likely that the gun was just heavily used and they never brought it back in for a replacement. A modern tank barrel is good for only a limited number of rounds. Now, I don't know if the German 120 has the same life expectancy as the American gun of 1500 AFC. Maybe it's less. Another possibility, though, I think a barrel split might be more likely, would be some form of obstruction to the barrel. There is also incidentally a fairly famous picture of an M1A2 that they forgot to take the muzzle bore sight device out. So the muzzle bore sight device is you basically shove it in the end of the barrel, you tighten it up, and what it does is basically it's a telescope that you can aim to see what the gun is actually looking at. So if you fire the gun with that still in, bad things happen. Right. I have absolutely no idea how long I've been at this. I can tell you that it's 1:45 in the morning, my voice is going, and I have basically run out of the questions that I'm going to deal with this month. So hopefully I'm going to start to claw my way back into a more regular schedule. So I hope you found the above interesting and informative, and I'll see you on the next one.